France invaded Algeria in 1830, and the conquest took nearly 2 decades. From the outset, the Algerian conquest was different from most other colonial ventures. Algeria became a settler state, one of the few apart from South Africa. The settlers were by means not all from France. They included Italians, Spanish, and Maltese merchants and shopkeepers of modest means, laborers, and peasants. By the 1870s, in several of the coastal cities, this new Creole community outnumbered indigenous Algerians, and within it, other Europeans outnumbered the French. Appropriated land, and French business concerns took cork forests and established mining in copper, lead, and iron. Economic activity was for European benefit. The first railroads, for instance, did not carry passengers. They took iron ore to the coast for export to France, where it would be smelted and sold. The French acquired Tunisia in 1881, northern and central Vietnam, and Laos and Cambodia in 1893, and they also started the establishment of the Federation of French West Africa, a loosely organized administration to govern an area 9 times the size of France, including Guinea, Senegal, the Ivory Coast, and vast stretches of the Western Sahara. This was in the year 1895. The Federation aimed to rationalize the economic exploitation of the area and to replace booty capitalism with a more careful management and development of resources. They embarked on ambitious public works projects, including the construction of railroads, harbors, and sanitation systems. Transportation costs ran very high. Labor posed the largest problems. Here as elsewhere, Europeans faced massive resistance from the African peasants, whom wanted to do everything from building railroads to working mines and carrying rubber. The Europeans resorted to forced labor, signing agreements with local tribal leaders to deliver workers, and they turned a blind eye to the continuing use of slave labor in the interior. This map shows in the light blue the areas governed by the French, starting out in Algeria, spreading to Tunisia, and then French West Africa. The French had attempted to carry this all the way to the eastern part by taking the Sudan, so this way the Atlantic Ocean would be connected to the Red Sea. However, as I mentioned in the earlier slides concerning British imperialism of Africa, the French and British met at Fashoda, Sudan, and the French backed down due to common problems with the Germans. The French would also get involved in Southeast Asia. The first group of people to colonize that area were the Portuguese. In medieval European history, Venetians began to trade with the Arabs. The Arabs in turn controlled much of the sea trade with Asia. Note the spread of Islam to Indonesia. Europeans wanted cloves and pepper and other spices to doctor their meat, especially in the summer when there was no refrigeration. The Ottoman Empire blocked the trade routes around 1400, and Portugal and Spain used new technology to sail large vessels for exploration. The Portuguese built a base on the island of Macau in southern China. It still exists today and is the world's oldest colonial outpost. The Portuguese then attempted to set up a base of FIFO near the port of Da Nang outside of Vietnam as a way station for traders in 1535. The outpost never became a strong trading settlement. Traders and Catholic missionaries were always visiting Vietnam in small, non-provocative sessions. Eventually, the Portuguese lost the valuable spice trade to the Dutch, and British continued their missionary zeal in Asia. From the 17th century, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese converted to Catholicism. In the early 1600s, Alexander Rhodes, a French Jesuit, developed Quoc Ngu. This allowed for the translation of Vietnamese with its hundreds of Chinese characters into Latin. The Vietnamese upper class wanted commerce with the West and embraced the new ideas, while the peasants thought by adopting Christianity they could be free to escape the harshness of the upper class that embraced the strict Confucian system. Rhodes preached against polygamy and gained the ire of the emperor's concubines. He was kicked out of Vietnam initially, re-entered several times, and was imprisoned. The Portuguese were a waning power, and he sought help from the Vatican and France to help the beleaguered Catholics. 4 years after Rhodes' death, the French founded both the East India Company and the Society of Foreign Missions in 1664. Both were intended to advance French business and religious views in Southeast Asia. The French competed with the British in China and India, but never really gained a firm grip on Vietnam. One such incident was the 1771 Tay Son Rebellion, named after the Tay Son Mountains in southern Vietnam. Vietnam had separate emperors in the north and the south. In the south, three brothers revolted against the Nguyen rulers. They first captured the tiny port of Saigon. They gained allegiance from the peasants by instituting land reform and lowering taxes. The Vietnamese king met with Bignot de Behan, a French priest, who was a Christian extremist. He had trained Vietnamese priests through the Society of Foreign Missions on the island of Paulo Conde in the South China Sea. He initiated a treaty between the Vietnamese and King Louis XVI of France in 1787 to provide troops for the Vietnamese. However, Louis's finances were strained just before the French Revolution, so Pinot enlisted help from wealthy French merchants in India to form his own army. The French sent around 2,000 fighters and 2 ships. Pinot died in 1799, but his forces allowed Nguyen Anh, one of the former emperor's sons, a victory. In June of 1802, Nguyen Anh adopted the new name Gia Long, Gia from Gia Dinh or Saigon, and Long from Ton Long, Hanoi. It was meant to state that Gia Long had unified northern and southern Vietnam. Notice Hanoi in the north and Saigon in the south. The Gia Long dynasty built a new capital at Hue in the middle of the country and used Chinese architecture for their new capital. The government ruled with an iron fist. They raised taxes and restricted landowning. Insurrection followed. The French were busy in Europe with the Napoleonic Wars. By 1819, Gia Long died and a new ruler went into isolation. The French wanted to rebuild their shattered empire. The new ruler, Minh Mang, and later his son Tu Tri, started a crackdown against Catholic missionaries. In response, the missionaries stepped up their pressure on the French government to intervene militarily and to establish a French protectorate over Vietnam. During this period, French traders became interested in Vietnam once more, and French diplomats in China began to express the view that France was falling behind the rest of Europe and gaining a foothold in Asia. Commanders of a French naval squadron permanently deployed the South China Sea after 1841 and also began to agitate for a stronger role in protecting the lives and interests of the missionaries. Given tacit approval by Paris, naval intervention grew steadily. In 1847, 2 French warships bombarded the port city of Da Nang, destroying 5 Vietnamese ships and killing an estimated 10,000 Vietnamese. The purpose of this attack was to gain the release of a missionary. In 1857, the French Emperor Louis Napoleon ordered military action again because Tu Duc, the son of Tu Tri, had again cracked down on foreign and Vietnamese missionaries. A few French were killed, and Louis Napoleon had been persuaded that invasion was the best course of action. French warships were instructed to take Tourane, the port city that we call Da Nang today, without any further efforts to negotiate with the Vietnamese. Tourane was captured in 1858. Notice Tourane right south of the city of Hue. Gia Dinh or Saigon and later Ho Chi Minh City would be captured in early 1859. In both cases, Vietnamese Christian support for the French predicted by the missionaries failed to materialize. Vietnamese resistance and outbreaks of cholera and typhoid forced the French to abandon Tourane in early 1860. Meanwhile, fear was growing in Paris that if France withdrew, the British would move in. Also current in Paris at the time was the rationalization that France had a civilizing mission, a duty to bring the benefits of its superior culture to the less fortunate lands of Asia and Africa. This was a common justification for the colonial policies of most of the Western countries, the white man's burden. Meanwhile, French business and military interests increased their pressure on the government for decisive actions. Thus, in early 1861, A French fleet of 70 ships and 3,500 men reinforced Gia Dinh, and a series of bloody battles gained control of the surrounding provinces. In June of 1862, Emperor Tuduc signed the Treaty of Saigon, agreeing to French demands for the secession of 3 provinces around Gia Dinh, which the French had renamed Saigon, and the island of Paulo Condori, as well as for the opening of 3 ports to trade, free passage of French warships up the Mekong River to Cambodia, freedom of action for the missionaries, and payment of a large indemnity to France for its losses in attacking Vietnam. The missionaries, however, had served only as an initial excuse for French intervention in Vietnam. Military and economic interests soon became the primary reasons for remaining there. In 1863, France forces the King of Cambodia to sign a similar agreement. Cambodia is now run by the French. In 1882, the French capture the capital of Hue, and in 1883 they capture Hanoi. In 1887, France formally establishes the Indo-Chinese Union, comprising the colony of Cochin China and the protectorates of Annam and Tonkin, and Cambodia, with Laos being added as a protectorate in 1893. Thus, the French carved Vietnam into 3 provinces, hoping to divide the country's opposition. Consequently, Frenchmen were recruited to staff a new, continually expanding bureaucracy. By 1925, there were 5,000 European administrators ruling an Indo-Chinese population of 30 million, roughly the same number used to administer British India, which had a population more than 10 times as large. Under the French laws applicable to individuals, Vietnamese were prohibited from traveling outside their districts without identity papers, and they were not allowed to publish, meet, or organize. They were subject to corvée, and they could be imprisoned at the whim of any French magistrate. The colonial police enforced the law through a network of French and Vietnamese agents. By 1930, more than 80% of the rice land in Cochin China was owned by 25% of the landowners, and 57% of the rural population were landless peasants working on large estates. Although the situation were better in the north, landless peasants in Annam totaled 800,000, and in Tonkin nearly 1 million. Heavy taxes and usurious interest rates on loans were added burdens on the peasants. More than 90% of rubber plantations were French-owned. 2/3 of the coal mined in Vietnam, nearly 2 million tons in 1927, were exported to France. Manufacturing was limited to cement and textiles, partly to placate French industrialists who saw Indochina as a market for their own goods. The Vietnamese were forced to study French, and many of the wealthy Vietnamese elites sent their children to Paris to study abroad. So the French would have complete control of Southeast Asia, not only the 3 provinces of Vietnam, but also Cambodia, as well as Laos.